collection spaces so you can see them up close and in plenty of detail. We also give you the chance to speak to some of our museum scientists. So Nicola and Matt's here with us today. They're two of about 300 to 350 scientific staff we have here at the museum. We've got researchers and curators and PhD students. So the next half hour is your chance to speak to them face to face and ask them any questions you might have about the conservation units, what it's like to be here at the museum, anything that pops into your head at any point in time. Don't be shy, just give us a wave and we'll take your questions as and when they come. So Nicola and Matt, thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon.
For having us.
So perhaps we could get a very brief introduction from both of you. What do you actually do here at the museum?
We're part of the conservation here in the museum. We're the people that work behind the scenes, looking after some of the specimens you may have seen on display today, but also the millions of specimens we keep is a resource for researchers all around the world. Specifically, we're working on a large-scale conservation project, working with fossil collections in the museum, safeguarding them for the next generations.
So you both, and Matt, are you both working on the same specific project at the moment?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so we're going to come on to that in lots of detail in a minute, but perhaps maybe Nicola, if you could tell us a bit more about the unit and the purpose it kind of serves.
So it's the responsibility of the conservation department to look after the museum collections. This can be anything from collections care, monitoring the conditions in temperature, humidity, light levels, and that's in gallery spaces as well as our stores, and treating any specimens that look like they need a bit of love. So it can be anything from cleaning, replication. We also do a lot of fossil prep. So any of the fossils that you see on display, they may have been worked on by the Conservation Centre.
So in this slightly curious picture in the top left where it looks like the elephant's kind of dressed up like an evil scientist. Why are they wearing lab? I mean, the two on the left just look like ghosts. Why are they wearing? Are you checking on the condition of the specimens whilst they're on display?
That was taking place during the whale project. So when we were taking apart the armature of the whale, we wanted to make sure the specimens below were completely safe. So we're just giving them a little cover, putting them to bed whilst we did a lot of work above them.
And with things like, say, a taxidermy specimen, and obviously our specimens come in a range of kind of ways. We've got like rocks and plants, and we've got taxidermy stuff. How would you go about cleaning something like a big ostrich like that? How would you clean that?
It's best practice for us to do the minimally invasive methods. So first we start with dry cleaning. That can be anything like these soft brushes you can see here, or even cosmetic sponges that people might have at home. We may move on to a low suction vacuum cleaner. And if things just need a little bit more work, we may use solvents. So we'll do solvent testing just to give things a wet clean. We also, things might need consolidation if they're beginning to become friable or are degrading.
And what about things like, what about wet specimens? So things that we keep in our spirit collection. Is there much you can do with that? If they're quite badly damaged, is there much you can do about that?
Often with wet specimens, the conservation required is if a fluid has begun to evaporate. Sometimes the alcohol content might need topping up or increasing. But there are things we can do for wet specimens. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that any adhesives we're applying are not soluble in whatever fluid is being stored in, such as alcohol. So it requires a bit more research, but we can remount things and adhere back any losses.
So I guess the main thing is we want to kind of clean things, we want to preserve them, but we don't want to add anything that might degrade the integrity of that specimen.
Exactly. We don't want to introduce anything that if an object's used by a researcher, that might interrupt the specimen for that potential.
Can anyone tell what this specimen is? It's quite hard. I'll give it to you. It's actually quite hard to deduce what this is from this picture. Matt, would you be happy to tell us about this?
Yeah, so this is an example of a sunfish that is undergoing some work in the conservation department. That green plastic-looking cover is actually a Epoplast jacket, and I can discuss that a little bit more a bit later, but that's really just to add support for very large specimens. There's an array of harnesses holding it up. You can see it's a bit of a mishmash there. It was quite difficult because this specimen needed to be taken apart, cleaned. It's been in the collections for a very long time. I believe it's the type specimen of that fish as well. So yeah, it's fundamentally very important. A few weeks' time, I think our manager, Lily Wellington is going to do a talk on it because she's actually spearheaded that conservation work.
And working in the conservation unit is kind of cool because when you get hold of these really historically old specimens, you find all kinds of things stuffed inside that was done, you know, decades and decades ago that you would never be doing in practice these days. Have you ever had a specimen come in that's been totally beyond repair?
Yeah, so as I was saying, as part of Project Airless, there are some specimens that have degraded beyond anything that we can do, and I can actually show you an example, which we can come to a little bit later on the table. Just to show you here. Let's zoom in on this specimen here. This is one that has undergone pyrite oxidation.
So do we know what that, because that's kind of hard to tell what that is at all. What was that?
This used to be a cephalopod or a fossil ammonite, which has completely degraded. There's acid burns on the label as well, so there's a bit of loss of information, but it's completely disintegrated. So, yeah.
Okay, so that was as a result of something very specific called pyrite decay, which is the crux of the project that you're working on. So we will definitely come back to that. Matt, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about about how you clean and repair fossil specimens. Maybe you could take us on the journey of the fossil from the field into the unit's labs.
Certainly. So if you click on the picture there, out in the field, paleontologists will often cover fossils in plaster of Paris and a Hessian mesh, just to allow them safe transport back to the lab. And then once they're there, the fossil preparator's first job is to take that jacket off, which can be incredibly difficult. From
What better way to do it than with a giant saw?
Yeah, you can use a saw, a Stanley knife or scissors sometimes will suffice. Once you've got that jacket off, the next thing to do is actually remove the surrounding rock or matrix encasing that fossil. So here's an example of our fossil preparator, Mark Graham, using a pneumatic pen, which is kind of like a pneumatic drill. Or you can also use an air abrasive, which is kind of like a miniature sand blaster, essentially, to remove that surrounding rock. Once that's done, we will move on to cleaning the specimen, and Nicola's just mentioned a few examples there. Soft dry brushes are very good. Cosmetic sponges also work well because they are very gentle on the specimen and suffer less from drag. And here's an excellent example of our colleague Amy just dry brushing a pterosaur specimen, which is a good example. Then what we do is, as I'm sure you can imagine, many fossils are broken into a fantastic array of pieces, and it's our job to piece them together. We use an adhesive called Paraloid B72, which is reversible, and this is very important for our researchers because if they want to have a look at the inside of the bone or take apart the fossil to do some research on it, all they have to do is add acetone and that adhesive removes. This is myself working on part of the Nesia sauropods as part of a volunteering project, and yeah, just using that Paraloid B72 adhesive to adhere an array of pieces. I'm just looking, I don't think I have any clue how any of those pieces go back together. That's probably why I'm so focused.
Did you at least know you knew what organism it came from?
Yeah, I knew we knew the animal it came from, but often, as you can see in those little bags there, they will have just fragments, bits and pieces that have just either fallen off the main specimen during the field, and sometimes it's our job to work out if we can put them back together again. The good thing about the Paraloid, actually, I should also mention, is that you can thin it down with the acetone, so it becomes more like a liquid, and you can inject it into cracks in a specimen to consolidate it as a whole, so that's also really quite handy.
So how long would it take to, I guess it of course depends on the size of the specimen, but how long does this kind of process take to get it out of its protective casing and to piece everything back together?
Certainly. Basically, it could take up to years, depending on the size of the specimen, the surrounding rock and matrix, if it's incredibly hard. Limestone itself is very, very difficult to take off, and we actually have to put things like fossil fish in acid baths, and that can take anywhere up to 6 months. That's right, so you'll allow the acid to erode, eat away at the limestone, then you check the fossil fish and put a cover on it, and then put it back into the acid bath because you don't want it eating away the fossil.
Great stuff. Would anyone like to ask either Nicola or Matt any questions at this point in time? Anything that comes to your minds? Okay, so perhaps we should move on to Project Airless, and we can also move on to why this event is called Foolproofing Fossils. This project centres around something called pyrite, and for those of us who perhaps stopped studying chemistry a few years ago, maybe Matt, perhaps you could tell us what pyrite actually is.
Sure, so pyrite is essentially iron sulfide. It's a very, very common mineral. It can come in a variety of crystal forms, which I can show you. The most common being cubic. So there we go. So this, believe it or not, hasn't been cut at all. It's a naturally forming cube, and it's just the way the atoms align. It's not a perfect cube, we have measured it, but yeah, this is quite common. But as a very common mineral, it's also associated with fossilization. So I've got a fossil fish here, and if I can zoom in a bit, sorry about that. Okay, so can you see that kind of metallic sort of gold there? That's the pyrite, and that's been incorporated during the process of fossilization. As you can see here, and I'll show a few other examples of this mineral. We've got a larger example here, a smaller one. So yeah, it's cubic, and quite often, because of its metallic lustre, it's often mistaken as gold, hence its common name, fool's gold.
So this is the stuff that a lot of kids get quite excited about in museum gift shops, right? They want a piece of gold, and it does look very beautiful. But as I guess this project is kind of based around, it can be quite damaging to historical fossil specimens. What's actually happening? Why is it a problem in our collection?
Well, essentially, I don't know if you are aware of this. Crystals like this, large crystals, are completely stable, but microcrystalline pyrite, which is incorporated into fossils, because it has a larger surface area, it tends to be more reactive, and it will react with the environmental moisture and air to basically oxidize, and this is quite often known as pyrite decay, and it can be incredibly damaging to specimens. We've got a few examples on the table. There's some images there. So as part of this reaction, you get ferrous sulfate crystals developing. These are white yellowy crystals, and as they expand in the cracks, they can often blow apart a specimen. The reaction also produces sulfuric acid, which burns through drawers, labels, and destroys information, essentially.
I think you've got an example of a label on the table somewhere.
Yeah.
So perhaps while Nicola's getting that out, you can explain to us what you're doing in the unit to kind of try and track down. I mean, is this quite a known problem in collections?
It's been noted in collections for an extensive amount of time. Recently, there's been a lot more research from the 1980s onwards, but you can go through a lot of literature that has these incredibly archaic methods where they used to apply Savlon to specimens to try and protect it from this oxidation because they thought it was bacterial. So iron sulfate has been used for hundreds of years to make iron gall ink, to make sulfuric acid, and to darken leathers and dye textiles. So it can be incredibly useful in some instances, but it's one of the most devastating things that can happen to fossil collections.
Okay, so take us through how you guys are combating this problem in the museum.
We're undergoing surveys of the collections within the museum. We have about 7 million fossil specimens, which is a huge amount. So we're going through drawer by drawer, isolating the cases that are suffering this oxidation. And with these surveys, it offers us a way of monitoring this past the project's end date. The specimens that we are working on, these get removed. We have some cases on the table. We are removing these. They come to the lab with us. We thoroughly document them, produce condition reports, and then we're going to repack them in anoxic storage.
Okay, so just before we move on to that, you were saying that you're kind of surveying the collection. That's a lot of fossils to look through,
Yeah.
and that is essentially you guys pulling open all the drawers in our collections and kind of checking all the fossils. What are the telltale signs that something's got pyrite decay? Is it just those flecks of gold? That's quite hard to spot.
We have some examples on the table here. when I think we have an image of this one. When we're looking through the collections, we first look for these yellow, white, crystalline secretions on the fossils. There will also be evidence through acid burnt labels and boxes. In some instances, you can also get the acid, which is burning not only through the labels and the boxes, but it can go into the drawer below. It can completely burn through the drawer. We also look for expansion cracking, where the fossils are beginning to burst apart completely.
Okay, and that's because of the mineral. When it's exposed to O2, to oxygen, it has that effect. And this is of course, your response when you see something.
Yeah, it's devastating. And what you can't tell from this picture is Kieran has just got a face full of a sulphurous smell, which is also a brilliant indicator of the reaction happening.
Oh, so you can smell it?
Yeah.
Is it quite potent? Would you smell it straight away, just pulling open that drawer?
If it's not been sealed, yeah.
What does it? Can you describe that? Because I mean, people describe when they're on active volcanoes, they get that stench of sulphur. And I don't think I've ever smelled it myself. Can you describe it to us?
So sulphur is basically a rotten egg smell. If any of you ever smell rotten eggs, it's that smell.
Okay, so you survey the collection, you see these signs of decay, and I'm sorry I interrupted you. So you then, once you've seen some that have issues, you remove them from the collection. What happens then?
We, once in the lab, once they've been documented in condition report, we will undertake any remedial conservation. That can be the dry brushing, removing of the salts from the surface. We may consolidate any specimens with expansion cracking, and the method we're predominantly using is preventative. We are repacking the specimens in new anoxic enclosures.
When we say anoxic enclosures, what do we mean by that?
It means we're removing the air from what they've been packaged in. So without the O2 in contact with the specimen, we're able to halt the reaction.
Okay, so you're able to halt the reaction, but there's no way of going back and removing the damage done, really.
There's no way of stopping it.
That sounds very negative. What you're doing is obviously great, but no, it's great. In fact, this image is I think this is a really nice example of what you first encounter in the work that you guys do and how much you can clean up a specimen and make it look lovely and pretty again. Is that your work in particular?
Yeah, I'm trying to think which one of us actually did that. It's a very good
Kieran.
job.
Yeah,
Definitely Kieran. But yeah, so on the left is the condition photo of the specimen, and then the right is the process photo, so what we've actually done to it. You can clearly see we've re-adhered the specimen, we've tried to dry clean brush off any of those ferrous sulfate crystals, and we've also started doing something with regard to the labels, so trying to salvage some of the acid burned labels, because being a historical collection, there's a lot of information on these labels that we will try and preserve if we can. It's incredibly difficult. Speaking from personal experience, they tend to just disintegrate the moment you touch them with tweezers. But what we're trying to do is back them on Japanese tissue paper and using methyl cellulose, stick it on there, so hopefully we can just preserve that label. It's something that we don't put the labels in for chemical treatments, which I might explain a bit later, because they can become quite brittle after that treatment as well, which just exacerbates the issue even more.
So Nicola mentioned putting some of the specimens into an anoxic environment in these special, that's, for example, this bag here, right?
Yes.
And that bag is made up of how many layers?
7 layers, and one of them is ceramic, much like people's plates at home, which we think is great. It's really hard to make it sound as wonderful as it is, but that's an oxygen barrier to stop the transfer of oxygen within the environment.
And they need to be very specially heat sealed to make sure no air gets back in.
And we also pop in these oxygen scavengers here, which are filled with iron filings, and as they oxidize, it removes the oxygen within the enclosure.
And what happens if you have a specimen that's too big for a bag like that?
So basically there are a number of chemical treatments that we can do on particularly large specimens, immovable vertebrate fossils, like some of the ones on the Marine Reptiles Gallery you may have seen, like the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. They've been known to suffer from pyrite decay. We can mix something, it's a bit of a mouthful, it's called ethanolamine thioglycolate. and I have practiced that many times, you can mix it with something called Sepiolite, which is a magnesium silicate to turn into a paste, and apply it directly to areas of oxidation on the specimen. It's very handy in that this treatment removes the decayed byproducts in solution, halts the reaction. It turns it, I don't know if we've got any close-up examples, a kind of like a purpley mauve colour that we have to be aware of. And some of our previous colleagues here are covering it in clean film so that obviously the vapours don't get dispersed around the gallery, because I'm pretty sure that the galleries were still open whilst they were doing this treatment. It's very good, very effective, and yeah, it's the only way of really treating large specimens that I'm aware of. I should also mention, actually, for those chemist enthusiasts out there, that ethanol is an isopropanol, so the specimen will not be exposed to water during treatment, which is obviously a great benefit to us, because obviously moisture exacerbates the reaction even more.
So how far through our fossil collection have you guys made it? Are you only a tiny way through?
Yeah, we've had a few teething problems, especially with the larger vertebrates, with their fossils being located throughout the collection. That's more to do with the digitisation aspect of the project more than anything else. We're nearly 2,000, nearly treated 2,000 specimens, and there is an estimated 10,000 specimens suffering from this pyrite decay in our collections. But that was based on very preliminary surveys, so people would look through one drawer in 10. So, as Nicola mentioned, part of our project is actually to go through a detailed survey of the collections to find out if this is the case.
And are certain fossils, I mean, with our collections, we know what locations they've come from, because that's the data that kind of comes in with the fossils. And given that this problem comes in accordance with the presence of a certain mineral, are certain locations at higher risk of pyrite decay?
Yeah, certainly. So any fossils from Lyme Regis and Charmouth, the Lower Lias, are susceptible. Places like Folkestone, which is quite close to me, Galt clays, the London clays in and around London also have pyrite as well, Oxford clays near Peterborough. These are all areas where pyrite is common and often associated with the fossilisation process. The best thing we can actually suggest in a cost-effective way, because I don't think anyone has a jar of ethanolamine thioglycolate sitting on the side, is use Tupperware containers, which I might actually put here, which are airtight. And you can also put in these silica sachets that you often find in shoes and cameras and things like that, just to dry out the specimen and help them last longer, which is very good.
It's certainly really interesting to talk to you guys about it, because I think some people think that when we get all our fossils into our collections, they're old and preserved and they're not at risk of any further damage when they obviously are. We've got a couple of minutes left if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask Matt and Nicola. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, in regards to the labels that have disintegrated, you mentioned something about digitising them. Do you preserve the information digitally and do 3D scans of some of the fossils to preserve them digitally?
Okay, do you want me to handle this one?
Yeah.
Cool. Basically, yeah, so part of the digitisation process is actually just taking photos, which are about 10 megabytes. Yeah, there's me. Yeah, I'm not one for apps, but I've had to learn quickly. So a couple of apps were designed so that any photographs that are taken can be associated with the catalogue record for that specimen on our collections database, KEMU, quite quickly. We will record any information. When we're doing condition reports, we can often write out any information that we can see on the labels as well, just so that there is a permanent record of it. So yeah, it's a very good question. It's part of the project.
Yeah, go for it.
If like one of your fossils gets broken or anything, do you find that is there anything you can find in one of the fossils that you might not have seen if it wasn't broken?
Oh, that's a great question.
That is an excellent question. Yeah, so as I was talking about, pyrite often, when it's incorporated during fossilisation, it gives a metallic sheen. But sometimes the more problematic ones, if I can show you this gastropod shell, there was no indication of this specimen having pyrite in it until it literally exploded from the inside because of the pyrite crystals. So often when a specimen breaks, we can actually see how the pyrite's been incorporated at a microcrystalline level into the specimen. So, yeah, sometimes it's a mixed blessing. Mixed blessing.
Does anyone? Yeah, please.
What did you find inside the taxidermy specimen? Do you see something that you find funny things inside?
Oh, that was in particular
That's
reference
the
to the sunfish. So
We actually found a chair, some floorboards. Yeah, really lots of newspapers, and we've had a volunteer that's been re-humidifying them all, so we can kind of date and know what was happening at the time. It's really fascinating.
can we give people an idea of roughly how old the specimen is? Roughly, is it from sort of 19th century or?
Sorry, not sure on that one.
Pretty old, because we haven't stuffed specimens with chairs in quite a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of wood chip, hay. Yeah.
Anything within arm's length, I suppose. But that's a similar situation, I think. With the whale, right? They've like in terms of the way that skeleton, which of course has now been taken down, ready for rehanging next year. In terms of the armature and how that was hung in the whale hall is quite different to how we probably do it today, right?
Sure. I mean, for example, when they were taking down the whale, the intervertebral disc, the spaces in between the vertebrae, were packed with lots of old newspapers at the time. And part of Cheryl's job was actually to piece together some of these newspapers to just give a historical record of the mounting of the whale. It's really quite interesting.
And there are great examples of where it kind of looks like they've just happily just like hammered through the bone and just drilled through it, shoved metal rods through it, anything to get it home. I think we've a little more, not to, the techniques that didn't perhaps exist back then that do now, so we're a bit more careful these days. Yeah.
How do you determine how old a specimen is, a fossil, and how accurate are your methods?
So basically, for a fossil, to determine how old it is, we use something called radiometric dating. It's very similar to carbon dating. So there are a lot of radioactive minerals in the ground that have a steady decay rate, and we can actually measure this over time to get an accurate picture of how many millions of years something is. And often we will measure more than one mineral to get an accurate thing, but it's not to the day or to the time. We don't have that level of accuracy, but we can pinpoint something within a range of millions of years.
What was the second part of your question? Sorry, I missed it.
I asked how accurate are the methods,
Oh, okay,
basically.
sorry. You did answer that.
You did answer it.
We can take maybe one more.
You mentioned microbial decay as well. So is that something you usually find in fossils?
So something I haven't mentioned actually is pyrite is a byproduct of sulfur-reducing bacteria. I like to think of it as bacterial poo. It's a mineral produced as part of its respiration, I believe, but with regards to the process of oxidation, which happens later when a fossil has been exposed, some people, as Nicola mentioned, thought it was bacterial decay because the way the collections were stored was geologically, so lots of different fossils but from the same horizon or bedding plane were stored together, so they thought it was spreading from drawer to drawer, whereas our collections are stored very differently. They're stored taxonomically, so we'll have fossils from the same locality in different locations all throughout the museum. Interestingly, above, I believe, 90% humidity, so by this time the reaction has already started, Theobacillus feroxidans is a sulfur-reducing bacteria, can be found as part of the reaction, but I think it's more just taking advantage of a reaction that's already started. Bacteria are involved, but at a very, very late stage of the oxidation process.
Great, thank you very much. That is your heavy dose of chemistry for
Yeah.
the weekend now. We
Serious
are going to have to draw things to a close, but Matt and Nicola will be happy to maybe hang around for a couple of minutes at the end, so you can come down and have a look at some of these specimens, ask them any remaining questions you didn't get a chance to ask. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Please join me in thanking them.